Hi again, friends of First Presbyterian Church, Oregon. Now what I want to do is go through that list that I created, and you should have a copy of some historical instances that I feel like led Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to write his letter from a Birmingham jail. And remember, his letter was written in response to a letter that was written by 8 clergy or spiritual leaders of the time. First of all, I just read to you the testimony of Catherine Ramage, the 11-year-old daughter of Reverend Edward Ramage, the pastor of First Presbyterian Church and leader of the Reformed Churches group in Birmingham, Alabama. You can also find that on a website called kidsinbirmingham1963.org. I also shared with you some of the responses that a good friend of mine, the Reverend Kat Dodson Goodrich, who was the current associate pastor at First Presbyterian Church, Birmingham, Alabama, shared with me. She talked to me, and I learned as well that by the 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama had been nicknamed Bombingham because of all the different bombings of places and buildings. There was the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, in which 4 little girls died in September of 1963. Westminster Presbyterian Church, that still exists today, was the Black Presbyterian Church, where former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was raised and was ordained as an elder. And also there were these things called children's marches, and you can go to the sites that they were held in Birmingham. They're marked with historical markers and often observed on an annual basis. Even the children of Birmingham recognized the need for protest. And on May 2nd, 1963, at the 6th Street Baptist Church, thousands of school children skipped school to march in downtown Birmingham. Authorities turned the dogs and hoses on them, arrested and put them in paddy wagons and school buses, and took them to jail. It was said to be more effective than many of the earlier civil rights protests. Now, Martin Luther King was in Birmingham in April of 1963 as a part of the collective movement, including the Southern Leadership Conference, or the SLC, to put pressure on downtown merchants to desegregate. King took his letter, which he had written in the margins of newspapers, out of the prison when he was released. So why would Dr. Martin Luther King write this letter? Let's take a look back. And I want you to kind of jump in a time machine with me, and we're going to go from 1619 all the way to the Reconstruction era of American history. And then in my next portion, we'll carry on. In 1619, in Jamestown, Virginia, the first African slaves were brought to the American colonies. This was 400 years earlier. The original plan for the slaves, or slave labor, was to use Native Americans. But the diseases of European origins that were brought to the United States, or the colonies at that time, and spread very quickly among the Native Americans who had never been exposed to them, wiped out populations, everything from smallpox and influenza to common colds. So they needed a new source for manual labor to work the rich and fertile soil, especially of the American South, but also the plains as the United States grew. In 1776, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." If you haven't noticed or realized through your own study of history, all men in this country, and in fact all women, were not created equal, or that has not been honored. And let me give you some examples from history that prove that, and give especially people of color, but especially Black people and African Americans, basis and proof. In 1787, as the United States continued to grow and different states were being admitted to the Union, And you can see a map or a picture in some images that I sent to Pastor Kathleen. In 1787, Congress, as they were admitting different states as both slave or free, and as we expanded westward, there was this proposal called the Three-Fifths Compromise, or also known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because it centered around the admission of Kansas and Nebraska to the Union. And it said that because the northern states and their representatives in Congress said no, representation in Congress should only be based on citizens and on male white people. But the southern states argued and said, hold on, we have all of these people and they should count as full people in determining representation. So there was a struggle back and forth, and usually whenever there's a struggle in the halls of Congress, they try to compromise. In this case, they were compromising on who was and was not a man or a human being. And that is part of the stain of slavery and the idea of race and color in this country. So in 1787, we had the Three-Fifths Compromise, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that admitted one as a slave state and one as a non-slave state. And it said that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person, not even a whole person, in determining population and representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. And again, representation in the U.S. Senate, as it always has been, is based on equality. Each state has 2 senators. I want to encourage you to find an image where somebody next is holding a poster that reads, "I am a man." And I've always seen those, and I've found this idea of somebody standing there holding a poster or wearing it across their chest that says, "I am a man." And as a young person, I wondered, why would somebody have to say that or share that? And these were often seen during the civil rights movement and marches of the 50s and 60s. If I had to equate them to something today, that idea of saying, "I am a man," is almost equivalent to the phrase, "I can't breathe," that's being used today in the Black Lives Matter movement in this country. What I learned over time, though, and especially in studying these things from 1787 and 1820, is that people in Congress were not considering all men to be created equal, which is what the Declaration of Independence said. And they were counting human beings, slaves, as less than human. So therefore, justification and reasoning as to why somebody would have a poster and carry it that said, "I am a man." In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise. And again, free state, slave state, free state, slave state. Maine would enter the Union as a free state, and Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. And it went back and forth like that, so on, as we continued our westward expansion and that idea of manifest destiny. In 1857, there was something known as the Dred Scott decision, or the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The Supreme Court said that the U.S. Constitution was not meant to include American citizenship and its rights for black people, for slaves. In 1861, you have the Civil War. Some people will tell you, and it's taught at dinner tables and has been in the past and probably is today, people that try to justify the meaning of the Civil War or the reason it was fought as states' rights. Other people will say that it was fought to preserve the Union. And this is overall often used to disguise what was at the heart and the reason for fighting the Civil War, and that was slavery. People that, like John C. Calhoun and others, that were preaching states' rights and fighting for that, were right in that that was part of the Civil War, but what was the states' right that they were arguing about? It was the states' rights to be able to have slaves or not. So yes, states' rights was one of the big reasons that the Civil War was fought. But again, I remind you, what states' right was it? It was the idea of slavery. So at the end of the day, the Civil War was fought over slavery. The Union was dissolved and divided. Our country, brother versus brother, person versus person, state against state, was fought over the right to own another human being or not. You see, the South was agricultural based, and so slaves were seen as an economic commodity versus the industrial North or mechanizing North and their factories. You see, the regions were interdependent on one another. You get all these raw materials in the South, like the cotton and the vegetables and the indigo. And they're sent to the North, to the factories, to be turned into finished goods. The North couldn't exist without the South, and the South couldn't exist without the North. January 1st, 1863, issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed slaves in areas of rebellion. You've heard of the holiday of Juneteenth that's come up recently. And Juneteenth, again, was the idea that the Emancipation Proclamation and the war being, and then later on the war being ended, it took a long time purposefully for it to reach the farthest reaches of the Union, or places like Texas and in the West. And so finally, with Juneteenth marks the holiday when the very last people in the farthest reaches of the Union learned that the war was over, that the slavery was illegal and had been, and they were freed. But the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, freed slaves in the area of rebellion. It was something that Abraham Lincoln felt he needed to do. There's several recent movies, but I would encourage you to be in touch with an African American person, because on New Year's Eve they generally hold a service called a watch night service, in which they commemorate how on December 31st, 1862, they watched at the doors of the church for midnight when the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect, and they were freed and could make the run north or into areas where that would be honored. Because just because the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and was a law did not mean that it would be honored at a time of war in the South or other areas of rebellion. Some things to take into consideration. April 14th, 1865, you have the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. I wonder, what if this had never happened? How would have things have turned out? John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer, and he took the life of President Lincoln while he was sitting in Ford's Theater watching a show. And then finally, that brings us to Reconstruction, or what happened in the post-Civil War. And in the Reconstruction era, people of color had more rights in 1865 than they did in this country in 1963. So we left off at the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period, again, is that period just post-Civil War. The war is over. People are returning to their homes. The slaves have been freed. And remember, when you turn out 3 million people out of bondage, but you don't really give them the resources or rights or abilities to live their lives, I feel like you've set them up to be doomed or to fail. And I believe in many ways that's what we did in this country during the Reconstruction. Who's in charge in the Reconstruction period? Well, you've got Congress, you've got your senators, you've got your representatives. But remember that Abraham Lincoln was killed in 1865. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And so taking on the presidency was the vice president under Lincoln at that time, and was President Andrew Johnson. A couple of things that come up, and before we do that, is I just want to remind you something I said at the close of the last video, and that was that in the Reconstruction era and right after the Civil War and in the period that followed, people of color in this country, Black and African Americans, the freed slaves, had more rights in 1865 than they did in United States in 1963. So what I wanted to take a look at were 3 amendments that came about during the Reconstruction era. They're amendments to the Constitution. It's not an easy process to amend the Constitution, but it's something that was done. And these amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, only help to bolster the right of these freed slaves. So let's take a look at those. The 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery and forced servitude in this country. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed citizenship, all civil rights and equal rights to those naturalized in the U.S. And what this does is it makes the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, remember in 1776 where it said, where all men are created equal, it made it true on paper. But making it actuality and to come to life was a different story. And the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the right to vote, regardless of race, color, previous servitude. It was known as black suffrage. Now here's a little bonus for you. The 19th Amendment was the Women's Suffrage Amendment. Successive amendments so that all men and women were extended basic rights of citizenship. Who was and is included when we used to say men and brother. So if you ever get a little bit prickly or tickly when someone corrects you on using men and brother and saying that it includes or included all people, I invite you to look at your history book around the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, and does it include men and women? A couple of other dates that are important throughout history that I think help to bolster Martin Luther King's reason for writing this letter. From 1865 to about 1870, in Pulaski, Tennessee, you have the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. It was originally formed as a social club, and in Greek, it means circle. They used terror and intimidation to try and defeat the radical Reconstructionists, and their purpose was to deny freed black slaves any advancement. They dressed in sheets and masks to scare and also to go unidentified by occupying federal troops. And these were often local leaders and affluent citizens that did these activities and were a part of the KKK. From 1915 to today, Hugo Black and company, they expanded their targets from just the freed black slaves to include Jews, Catholics, and other people or groups that they felt were undesirable. From 1877 to the 1950s, and this is something you hear a lot about, and one of the reasons that I can honestly say that people of color in this country had more rights in 1865 than they did in 1963. And it was something called Jim Crow laws. And there's a book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. I used that as a part of my historical studies in undergrad, and it's quite enlightening. But Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow was a character created around the demeaning characteristics of African Americans. The size of one's facial features. And what Jim Crow laws did was forced de jure segregation and helped to usher in the idea of separate but equal schools, restrooms, and waiting areas. The one thing that I've learned through studying Jim Crow laws and documentaries and other factual historical representations is that separate but equal, the separate part was often true, equal was often left to be desired. De jure segregation is separation by law, and the opposite of that is de facto segregation or segregation by choice. Again, a little vocabulary lesson for you. Finally, I want to bring up another Supreme Court case that is very important, and that's Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is when the Supreme Court ruled and upheld the idea of separate but equal and its doctrine, and only perpetuated the systemic racism, inequality, and injustice in this country. Another one that I don't have on here, but that you know of, is Brown versus the Board of Education, which later struck down the idea of separate but equal. So throughout our history, laws, the courts, Congress, all of this, including individual ignorance, hatred, has only perpetuated the idea of why people of color couldn't wait then and they can't wait now. And people of color in this country grow very frustrated and have over time, and especially now, of the continued and perpetuation of this inequality and injustice and different treatment based on the color of one's skin.